A news report announced that a small bank in California had closed, marking a major failure. That same night, an emergency meeting was held in Washington. At the company GTX, an employee walked into the office, followed by his assistant, who told him someone was waiting in the conference room. He walked into the staff room and noticed a gloomy atmosphere. No one could explain what was wrong. So, he went to a colleague's office and asked if something serious had happened. The colleague informed him that the company had shut down the mobile phone division in one of their locations. He also mentioned that a new system was being merged with the existing one, which was just a formal way of saying that jobs were being cut. Later, the employee met with a manager, who introduced him to someone from the legal team. The legal representative explained that due to restructuring, his position was being terminated. However, he would receive benefits for his 12 years of service. The employee asked if this meant he was being fired. The manager reassured him that they would help him find new job opportunities. Frustrated, he asked if the top executive was aware of this decision, but refused to sit down and left the room. Once seen as a powerful figure in the company, he was now just another worker leaving with a cardboard box. Even the most successful professionals are not immune to corporate layoffs. He started packing his things. His assistant asked about her job, but he admitted he hadn't inquired about her situation. In another office, a senior employee was talking with an assistant, who confirmed that several team members had been let go. The senior employee said he had been hiding all day and was shocked by the news. He shouted that he wouldn't let anyone fire him after 3 decades of loyalty, expressing how quickly long-term dedication can be discarded. Later at home, his spouse came back and found him cooking. Surprised by his presence at that hour, she asked why he was home early. He simply said he was making dinner. That evening, a couple had plans to visit a friend's house, but one of them refused to go. The other got upset and went inside, followed by their partner. They argued, one asking why the other hated their friend so much. That's when the truth came out. He had been fired. She became angry, reminding him of a promise that he would make sure his job was safe. He explained that the boss hadn't been in the office and someone else had made the decision. It's surprising how quickly "we're in this together" turns into "there's nothing I can do." Meanwhile, another man arrived home and asked his daughter where her mother was. She replied that she had a headache. As he headed upstairs, she excitedly told him their next family trip would be to Italy. She asked if she could come, and he replied that she could, though he wasn't even sure he'd be able to go. After all, vacations sound nice when your job is still secure. He entered the bedroom, and his wife asked if he had heard about someone else being laid off and whether they were still safe. He reassured her and said they needed to prepare for a dinner party. Because when your finances are collapsing, nothing says comfort like a fancy evening out. She told him he didn't need to come if he wasn't feeling well, but he said to give him a minute. Elsewhere, another man stood quietly in his kitchen, preparing a drink. His wife reminded him that they needed to leave early and not be late again. Later, the couple and their children arrived at the friend's house. Inside, they greeted the guests. The host asked how the man was adjusting from his previous well-paid international job to a new life. During their talk, a woman entered the room, and he complimented her, saying she looked younger than her age. She laughed and offered him a drink. At the same party, the host introduced an executive of the company, praising him as one of the first employees. The executive gave a speech about staying strong during hard times and gave credit to the company leader for its success. The leader then took the stage, thanked the audience, and praised the executive for helping build the company. Ironically, the same company that fired so many employees now celebrated visionary leadership, a move that felt more like a villain's arc from a comic book than true leadership. The next day, the man went to a job training center. Another man greeted him and pointed him to an orientation room. Inside, a woman explained the job expectations and said that fear and anxiety could be useful motivators. In today's world, everyone, neighbors, dentists, anyone, could be affected. At the company, executives met to discuss merging 2 departments. Some employees complained they were handling the same workload with fewer workers. One manager reminded them they were lucky to still have jobs and urged them to focus on winning back clients. Back at training, the man looked for a seat, but one was already taken. The earlier greeter offered him a spot and introduced himself. He said that others were afraid of new employees, but not him. When asked why, he said he was confident. The man explained he had a few months of severance pay and job search help. The other admitted he had a longer period, but time was running out. It was like a ticking clock. Later, the executive and the man had lunch. The executive asked how things were going and said the company had no choice but to lay people off. He explained that leadership was under pressure to raise the company's value to avoid a takeover. He gave the man contact info for marketers he had called on his behalf. But the man became angry, dropped the paper, and said he'd join a competitor and steal their clients. That's how fast loyalty can turn into revenge. At home, the couple talked about the lunch meeting. The man said his old boss had tried to help. His partner appreciated that and offered to look for a job to help with the bills. Then the man's father called, but he refused to take the call, not wanting any more advice. After all, it's easy to read bad news in the papers, but harder to live through it. Gene was thinking about better times when James invited him and Cynthia to join a New Year's trip to Sun Valley. Gene hesitated, explaining that his grandchild would be visiting. Later, as Gene lay outside, Cynthia came to check on him. He shared that he had lunch with Bobby and had half expected Bobby to throw a drink at him. Cynthia then mentioned she and Sue were planning a weekend getaway to Palm Beach and asked to use the company jet. Seeing Gene's expression, she quickly changed her mind and said they would fly commercial instead. Meanwhile, Maggie brought up the idea of selling the house, but Bobby refused. He didn't want to feel like they were stuck. He left for a job interview, driving alone while Maggie took the kids. Some people can easily buy new homes. Bobby was trying to hold onto one he could no longer afford, hoping no one would notice. At the interview, the recruiter reviewed his sales experience and asked about regional sales. She then offered a position outside his area with a salary of $65,000. Bobby, frustrated, said he had earned $120,000 at his last job and had applied for the VP of Marketing role. She responded that there were many strong candidates. Bobby insisted he was one of them. After that, Bobby returned to the office and started calling marketing professionals for job leads, but none were successful. He even left a voicemail for Sally, clearly annoyed that she hadn't returned his calls. Back home, he saw Drew sitting alone outside. When asked what was wrong, Drew said he was growing up and could manage things. Bobby then told him he had lost his job, but everything would be okay. At Thanksgiving dinner at Jack's house, the men talked about work while food was being served. Jack asked Bobby about his job, and Bobby gave a vague reply. Jack brought up an article stating that Salinger made 700 times more than the average GTX employee, a reminder that top executives rarely feel the struggles of the average worker. Before eating, Carson prayed, thanking God for their health and asking that her dad find a job, unintentionally revealing Bobby's unemployment. Jack then offered Bobby a job, but he declined, not wanting to do manual labor. Elsewhere, James and his partner discussed financial setbacks. They considered either selling the new company or closing the current one. In the end, they chose layoffs. Gene disagreed, but James dismissed him. As usual, the first solution was cutting workers, not reducing executive pay or restructuring. Later, in bed, Maggie talked about their finances and suggested lowering the house price to sell it for $850,000. She questioned why Bobby refused Jack's offer. Bobby said he wouldn't work under him. At this point, pride was all he had left. Meanwhile, Gene was in bed with Sally. He asked her about the layoff criteria. She became upset and walked out. Another day, Bobby went golfing with a colleague, but was told his membership wasn't paid. He went home and asked Maggie about it. She admitted they couldn't afford next month's payment. She urged him to stop golfing and focus on finding a job to pay the mortgage. Bobby still wanted to appear successful, but Maggie reminded him of their real situation and asked him to cancel his golf plans. Few things show a fall from success like getting kicked off the golf course. Later, Bobby and Maggie had a serious talk. He shouted that at 37 years old, he couldn't even support his family. Maggie comforted him, saying things would eventually get better and that his family was there for him. She gave him a reassuring hug. Bobby went to another job interview. The recruiter mentioned that Dan Mass had given him a great reference. The role offered $90,000 with bonuses and commission. Though he couldn't make any promises, he said Bobby looked like the right fit. At last, a small glimmer of hope. But when Bobby followed up later, he was told the position was no longer available. Later, Bobby sadly watched as someone drove away in the car he had just sold. First the golf membership, now the car. His old life was fading piece by piece. At a party, Phil approached Jean to tell him that Sally had fired him. Jean went straight to his office and confronted her. She handed him a paper. He was being fired too. Jean and Phil sat down to reflect on the many years they had dedicated to the company, both now left with only disappointment and frustration. Jean returned home but ignored his wife's calls to join her upstairs. Meanwhile, Phil had started a new job working in a factory. At Joanna's office, Bobby and the team were surprised to see Phil. Joanna asked Phil if he smoked. When he said, sometimes, she advised him to quit. As he left, she warned him that at nearly 60, life outside work would be difficult. Later, Bobby visited Phil in his new office and pointed out that the company had to pay extra for that space. Phil replied that it was the least they could do after everything. He then asked about the dress code, and Bobby told him casual clothes were fine. Bobby made a call to the mortgage company. He said he had talked to someone last week who claimed he hadn't paid that month's installment. He offered to send a check. Maggie, listening nearby, smiled. After the call, she asked who it was. He replied it was the mortgage company. Which one? She asked. American Express, he said. Maggie then told Bobby that her employer had asked her to work the next evening. Bobby reminded her it was New Year's Eve. Their son Drew asked Bobby if he could give him a ride to his friend's house. Bobby said he was busy, so Drew went back upstairs. Bobby assumed Drew would play Xbox, but Maggie explained that Drew no longer had it. He had returned it because they couldn't afford it. That quiet sacrifice from a child was more painful than words. Later, Bobby went back to Jack's workplace and asked for a job. He started working that very day, helping Jack with construction. Bobby quickly got tired. Jack told him to carry 2 more boards. Bobby had once played the part of a wealthy businessman. Now he was struggling to carry lumber, a true lesson in humility. They ate lunch at the site. Bobby sat alone, staring at his hands. One of the workers noticed his blisters and explained it was from new gloves, then offered him an old pair. A small gesture, but full of meaning. The next day, Bobby returned to work. He was sandblasting, and someone told him to add more material to the mix. Jack joked that this job was just as easy as moving cost reports around an office. Meanwhile, Jean and his wife were at home. She asked about his plans for the day and mentioned that some old friends had invited them to dinner. Elsewhere, Phil arrived at a job interview. The receptionist asked him to sign in and wait. The room was crowded with applicants. Back at the construction site, Jack gave Bobby his paycheck. Bobby noticed an extra $200 and asked about it. Jack said it might be a mistake but told him to keep it anyway. That night, Jean joined his wife and her friends for dinner. He smiled and acted cheerful, but inside, he wasn't. He was still pretending to be in control, though he no longer was. Eventually, Bobby and his family had to move in with his parents. That night, Bobby went to see Drew, who was lying in bed wearing headphones. Bobby took them off and asked if he was okay sharing a room with his sister. Drew said he didn't mind. Once, Bobby could buy shoes without checking the price. Now he was thinking about which ones to sell to make ends meet. Jean's son and his family visited. Jean spoke with him while the children played outside. He shared that he was trying to buy a vineyard and looking for work. His son asked if he had talked to his mother and mentioned that she was thinking of selling her house because things were tough. Back at work, Bobby asked about a colleague named Mike and was told Mike had been arrested again. Bobby told Jack he knew someone who could fill in. A new worker named Danny soon joined, another victim of the job market now using tools instead of a laptop. Jean found Phil at a bar drinking. Jean offered to take him home, but Phil said he couldn't go back. His wife didn't want the neighbors to know he was unemployed. Jean asked if he wanted to go see a movie instead. Later, Bobby returned home and was told someone named Fred had called about a job. Even though it was in Boston, Bobby decided to accept it. Maggie was unsure, but Bobby said the job was as vice president of sales and marketing, exactly the kind of role he belonged in. "This is it. This is who I am," he said. Getting a high-level job title again seemed like a dream, but dreams often come with fine print. Like they say in Argo, this is the best bad idea we have. Bobby traveled to Boston and stayed in a motel. The next morning, he went to an office for a job interview, but learned his appointment was actually scheduled for the following week, not that Friday. Phil met James for lunch and asked about a job related to foreign executives. He was interested, but James told him he wouldn't hire anyone over 30 for that role. Apparently, years of experience don't matter when you're considered too old for certain jobs. Later that night, Jean found Phil angrily throwing rocks at a company building. Phil opened up about his financial problems, but they both knew there wasn't much that could be done. At home, Phil quietly washed the dishes, went to the garage, smoked a cigarette, then got into his car. He shut the garage door and started the engine, ending his life with carbon monoxide. The next day, Jean, Bobby, and others attended his funeral, a tragic, but sadly common ending for those who feel like they've lost everything. Afterward, Bobby and Jean visited the first place they ever worked. Jean reflected on how everything he spent decades building had disappeared. Later, Bobby returned home and apologized to Maggie for letting her down. She reassured him that things would eventually get better. The next day, Jean visited the company to speak with James. He asked why James didn't attend the funeral, but James only brought up Phil's wife. When Jean questioned the layoffs, James replied that he only did what the market demanded to keep the company alive. That same day, Bobby got a call from Jean about a new job offer. He went to talk to Jack, saying he was considering staying because he liked his current work. Jack, half joking, told him to take the job because he wasn't a very good carpenter. Later, Jean, who had started his own company called Mlar Maritime Associates, was in his office when Sally came in to congratulate him. She invited him to lunch, but he declined. As she left, she asked him to keep her in mind for any future roles. With fresh motivation, Bobby entered his new office, greeted the staff, and immediately began giving instructions. Though he had returned to the corporate world, he now had a different mindset. They would work just as hard inside that office as they had when searching for jobs, but now things felt a little more hopeful. The film offers a poignant reflection on the fragility of the modern work world, especially for those who, at one point, seemed to be the most solid. This drama, focused on the journey of characters facing the loss of their social and professional status, manages to touch sensitive chords. It explores universal themes such as dignity, resilience, and reinvention. What stands out about the film is its realism. The screenplay portrays situations that many people can relate to: losing a job, having to face a new role, often poorly paid and unrewarding. The protagonists, though in extreme situations, evolve with a sense of dignity, reminding us that, even in the greatest adversity, it is always possible to rise again. The artistic direction, though minimalist, serves the purpose of the film perfectly. The settings are realistic and highlight the contrasts between the old and new worlds of work. The actors, particularly in the lead role, deliver emotionally charged performances, often under an air of desperate calm. This simplicity in both performance and setting gives the film a very human dimension, emphasizing the pain and degradation felt by the characters, but also their ability to fight for their dignity and rebuild themselves. Finally, the film addresses a very relevant issue in the current economic context: the precariousness of careers, even for those who once seemed safe, and how society increasingly values productivity at the expense of humanity. It shows that beyond appearances and titles, there is a reality of suffering and struggle for survival, which resonates deeply with viewers. However, while the film has many strengths, it also has its weaknesses. While the direction is effective and sober, it can, at times, feel a bit too slow and repetitive. The everyday scenes of the characters, though realistic, can feel like they drag on without pushing the main plot forward. This creates an uneven pace, slowing the viewer's engagement with the story. Furthermore, some secondary characters, who could have brought an interesting dynamic to the plot, lack depth. For instance, the character of Jean's wife or Bobby's colleague seems more like a plot device than fully realized individuals. This weakens the film's emotional potential, as certain storylines could have been explored in greater depth to make the narrative even more powerful. Additionally, the film leans on fairly common cliches found in movies about professional crises: the protagonist's downfall, suicide due to social pressure, or the character who, on the edge of despair, finds a glimmer of hope through a temporary job. Finally, while the idea of returning to normal work to rebuild oneself is a positive message, it feels somewhat oversimplified in relation to the complexity of the reintegration process. The ending of the film, while optimistic, might feel almost too sugar-coated when compared to the harsh reality faced by those who, in real life, deal with professional reinvention. The film suggests that anything is possible with willpower, but it doesn't fully take into account the deep and systemic challenges of the job market. Overall, the film is worth watching for its realism and strong social themes. It succeeds in showing, in a sensitive and moving way, the harshness of the modern professional world, while offering insight into the possibilities of resilience. However, its pacing at times and the lack of certain emotional subtleties undermine its overall impact. This film speaks particularly to those who, having faced professional or personal hardships, may find a reflection of their own struggles in this story.